Welcome to cloudonaut Plus, your source for exclusive videos and online events for AWS professional. My name is Michael, and today I show you how I use AWS Security Hub to get an overview of the level of security in my AWS accounts. And this was a topic that quite a few actually kind of requested in the community and also in our second Ask Me Anything session. And this time I turned it into a video because I think that's quite a important topic. It's also a topic where lots of details are important. So that's why we will have the first video about Security Hub here today. And I promise that we will have further videos about the whole security topic and all the different services that we can use to make sure that we run our workloads in a secure way. So let's switch to the slides. Before we start with the content, I want to give you a couple of details what we will cover. So first, you will get a very short introduction into Security Hub. And then we will look into ways how you can comply with security standards using Security Hub. So that's the focus of today's video. And I will also share with you the lessons learned, basically how I use Security Hub these days, either in our own accounts or also if we visit a customer for the first time and enable Security Hub and turn this data into something useful for the customer. I also prepared two pitfalls for you. One is about the security score. I will talk about the details later. So this is the magic number that maybe some of you want to optimize for. And the other pitfall is about an error that pops up in Security Hub quite often. So I see this in many different AWS accounts, and it takes some time to understand why it happens, and I will show you what's going on. It's about an IAM check that returns an unknown error. So it's not very helpful. So that's why we have a look at it. All right. So what is Security Hub? So first, Security Hub provides a centralized and this is important, organizational-wide overview of all your workloads. So this means that you can run Security Hub either in kind of standalone mode, it covers only a single AWS account region, or you can run it in an org-wide mode where it aggregates all the data of all your AWS accounts. It still needs to run in each of the regions that you use it, so it doesn't kind of aggregate across regions, but it can aggregate across accounts, and that is very useful. So what does Security Hub actually do? It does two things, and this is kind of a little bit, maybe at the beginning, it doesn't really is necessary that both of those features are available, so it's a little bit misleading. But one of the features is Security Hub runs checks. So Security Hub itself runs checks based on security standards that are defined by AWS. So that's one of the features. This feature relies on AWS config to be active in the AWS accounts. So what Security Hub basically does under the covers, it creates config rules for you, and those config rules are defined by AWS and they check the security standards. That's feature number one. Feature number two is Security Hub integrates with many other AWS services and also third parties. And those services send security findings into Security Hub as well. So for example, just two examples, there is GuardDuty, there is Inspector, there are other services like the IAM Access Analyzer, and there are third parties, and they can all send data into Security Hub, and then you can have a look at it in a central place, and you also get nice statistics about how this is changing over time. So that is in a nutshell Security Hub. And I don't want to bore you with any more theory this time, and we will jump right into the AWS console. And I will show you how I use Security Hub. So if you visit the AWS Security Hub Management Console, you are greeted with a screen like that. And I will quickly hide the navigation bar. So you get different kinds of summaries. For example, this is about the findings from the different integrations. And as you can see, I have only the GuardDuty integration enabled, or the only service that I have enabled here is GuardDuty, so that's why only GuardDuty sends additional data into Security Hub besides the standard checks. And what you also can see is here the overall security score of all my AWS accounts using all the security standards. So that's kind of a first indication of how the account is is doing. You also get like kind of group by aggregates. So for example, you can see which account has most failed checks. So this is basically has most security findings, and all kinds of information are presented here at the top kind of level. You also get some charts. I have to admit, I don't really use that view often. So what I do instead is I go to security standards right away. So this is the view that I like most. Usually I enable at least the AWS Foundational Security Best Practice Security Standard. So you can enable them individually. So in this case, I also have enabled the SIS AWS Foundations benchmark, but I have not enabled the PCI DSS security standard. So I think it makes sense to start with one, and I would recommend starting with the AWS Foundational Security Best Practices. And one thing to keep in mind is that they actually overlap quite a bit. So if you start fixing findings from AWS Foundational Security Best Practice, you will kind of, as a side effect, also fix things that the SIS AWS Foundations benchmark would have flagged as a problem. So yeah, if you turn on both at the same time, that's also possible, but you might be a little bit overwhelmed by the number of findings. And yeah, so that's why I usually recommend to start with one. I wouldn't start with the PCI one because that really flags lots of things that are not really super relevant. Yeah, so the one that I usually start with is, as I said, AWS Foundation Best Practices. And if you click on that, you get again, now aggregated view, but only for this security standard. And if you enabled Security Hub in across your AWS organization, then this will automatically include data from all your AWS accounts. So one thing to keep in mind when you enable Security Hub in organization mode is that you can define a delegate admin for Security Hub, and that's highly recommended. So in your organizational main account, where you kind of create the AWS accounts, where you add them to, where you assign the service control policies, and where you group them in the hierarchy, in this account, you can define a delegated admin. And in my case, I created a special AWS account. It's my security account. So this is the account where I want to control Security Hub in. So from my organizational root account, I delegate into my security account, and then my security account becomes the admin for Security Hub. So this is where I can add accounts, where I can disable checks, where I can enable security standards for all accounts at once. So highly recommended to not do that in your root master account, but to have a delegated admin account, because otherwise all the security folks in your organization need access to the root AWS account. And that's not a good idea, because this account actually has kind of basic, you can have full permissions into any AWS accounts in your organization. So don't do that. Always use this delegated admin feature, which is now kind of, I think, the best practice also internally for AWS services to kind of follow that approach. So most of the security service these days come with this feature where you can delegate the admin control to a different AWS account. And that's exactly why, or the reason why they do it is otherwise all the security folks need or have kind of lots of permissions by default. All right, so let's go back to my screen here. So I talked a little bit about security in org mode stuff, but now let's look back at the AWS Foundational Security Best Practices security standard. So what we can see here at the top is a security score. And basically what AWS does to calculate the score is they look at all the checks, all the enabled checks, and then they divide, or they use, based on that, they look at how many of them have passed, and they divide passed divided by all enabled, and that's kind of the security score. There is one pitfall. I will talk about that at the end. So when you run Security Hub in organizational mode, then the calculation works a little bit different. And the problem are disabled checks. And we will talk about that as well in a minute. So let's look into the different checks. So you can quickly see they are either in status failed. And if a check is in status failed, that basically means there is a finding. So I mean, failed is probably not the wording here, but failed means there is something that does not comply with that check. And this check, for example, is about S3 permissions granted to other AWS account in S3 bucket policies should be restricted. So for some reasons, there's a bucket policy that grants access to another AWS account, and it is not restricted in a way that Security Hub thinks is the best practice. So that's one of the failed checks, and also it has severity high. Keep in mind, severity does not have any impact on your security score. So that might be a little bit confusing, but it actually doesn't matter if you fix a medium, a high, or a low severity finding. Doesn't influence the score in any other way. All right, so you can see there are a couple of failed things here. Then we have unknowns. Unknowns is something I talk about again in the pitfall section at the end. So those are checks that very likely we are not able to run successfully. So we don't know if it's failed or passed. So that's bad, shouldn't happen. It's an AWS problem, they should fix it. Not our business in this case. And then we have passed checks, and that's also fine. So passed basically means you comply with that rule. So that's how to say it. All right, so what you can do is let's select just one of the checks, and you immediately get again now it's drilled down into this specific check. So what you can see is we have one failed check of one finding basically, and you also see the resource. So that's the name of the S3 bucket that does not comply with that rule. So the question is, how can we actually comply with that rule? And the important part here is usually the remediation instructions, and that's a link. Every check has this link. It points to the AWS documentation. So that's the one that we see, and it basically tells us what we should do to fix that. So if you just follow the steps, you usually have a good idea of how you can solve the problem. So that's very nice. So they not only flag what's wrong, they also tell us how to fix it. So that's very useful, at least from my perspective. And I use that documentation a lot when fixing those errors. All right. The other option that we have is this disable button. There are checks that are not relevant in your scenario. So a couple of checks that I disabled is, for example, there is one requirement that the root account should have a hardware MFA token. If you manage your accounts with AWS organizations, then it is not really possible to fulfill that requirement. So that's why I usually just disable that check completely. And then if you disable it, you can kind of enter a reason why you disable it. And that's kind of the documentation for people that look after this later, kind of understand why the whole check was disabled. So that's one way to kind of make sure that Security Hub or kind of whitelist something in Security Hub. So you can disable the whole check. Another thing that you can do is for each individual finding, you also have ways to kind of work with the finding by using the workflow status. By default, the workflow status is new. As you can see, in my case, it is notified. Notified means that, okay, someone is working on it. So someone was notified that they should fix that. So if you work in a large organization, chances that you can fix this are low. So you have to reach out to some other team and ask them, okay, hey, please fix this S3 bucket policy of the bucket, this and that. And then they can work on that. So that's, I think, what the workflow status notified is about. You also have the option to suppress a finding. Suppress basically means is this again kind of a whitelisting. So this is kind of ignore that problem. It's not, we cannot fix it. We, for some reasons, it has to be the way it is. So for example, there is one check that checks if an S3 bucket is public. And there might be one bucket in your whole organization that has to be public because there are files stored in that bucket that are downloaded by your customers. So the bucket has to be public. So then you could either disable the check and then you would kind of get rid of or kind of lose the whole functionality. So other S3 buckets might be public and you would not notice it. Or you just suppress for this single bucket where you know it should be public and then you are still fine again. So that's what suppressing is about. And then last but not least, we have resolved. Resolved means you kind of fix the problem and then this is kind of marked as done. If there is a finding and you just change the configuration, if you wait long enough, Security Hub will pick that change up as well and kind of close the finding as well for you. So resolving is not necessarily needed. I mean, it's just for kind of humans to kind of make sure that we don't work on something twice. But after some time, and this can really be 12 hours in Security Hub, it will be also closed by the next run that checks all the config items. All right, so that's, I think, most of the important parts of working with checks and findings. And yeah, I can show you the ones that I disabled quickly. So one of them I already mentioned, so the hardware MFA thing, so I disabled that. And the other one that I disabled is about the default security groups and also like default VPCs. So for some reason, AWS deploys default VPCs and default security groups. And for some reasons, they do not comply with their own rules. So that's why they flag all of their own stuff as insecure, which is kind of weird because, I mean, why they just deployed in a way that it is compliant by default, but that's not how it works. No, they deployed in to their own terms insecure way, and then they ask us to make it secure. Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't like all this default stuff. So there is one problem with just deleting the default VPC. If you use CloudFormation, the partition, the get availability zone function depends on your the default subnets, so to calculate the available availability zones. So that's why it's not a good idea to just delete the whole thing. But in my case, I just ignore it, but I know lots of customers who go and patch it. The problem is with CloudFormation, you cannot change the default stuff because it was not created by CloudFormation. Terraform allows us to do that, so there are resources especially to modify the default VPC and default subnets. So you can do that with Terraform, so that was good news, at least in one of the last projects where we used Terraform to deploy everything, so we could do that in an automated way, which is good. But yeah, it's a little bit annoying. And also in the AWS documentation, you will find a section about checks that you might want to disable. And I mean, I don't know, but what's the reason for having checks in this security standard that you might want to disable? I don't know. So it is, of course, opinionated, and many of the checks are, I would say, questionable, and I question them if I don't think that they make any sense. So I can show you a couple of examples. So for example, there is this kind of very strong requirement to enable server-side encryption everywhere, which is, I think, fine. But I don't know, for example, SNS topics should be encrypted at rest. I don't know. I mean, data is not really stored there for a long time, so I'm not sure if that's the most important part. Then if you, for example, use GitHub or GitLab or like something that does not run inside AWS to deploy your stuff, you will have IAM users, and those IAM users will have credentials, and you will have to rotate them every 90 days according to Security Hub. So that's also a rule that might be easy or not so easy to follow, and all kinds of other checks that are here. I don't know if I can see something here. Amazon EC2 should be configured to use VPC endpoints, for example. This is also one of the checks that I usually just disable. They also kind of require you to enable all kinds of features. And for example, they also ask you to enable GuardDuty, for example. And I mean, yeah, they release a new service, then they add an item in Security Hub that checks that you enable the service which you pay for, and that's kind of an amazing money machine. But I mean, if you don't want to use GuardDuty, then just ignore that or disable that check because it doesn't make sense for any workloads, right? Okay, so last question before we talk about the pitfalls. What are actually the costs? And the thing is that all the security services are not free of charge, and some of them can get very expensive. And for most of them, it's not so super easy to understand the implications of enabling them upfront. So Security Hub, I think, solves that quite good. If you go to the settings and then there is a usage tab, you will get an estimation of how much you will likely pay for Security Hub. And keep in mind, the first 30 days are free. So there's a free trial for Security Hub. So if you enable it, basically after day 25 or so, I would recommend to check out the usage tab here to check the estimated costs and make sure that kind of makes sense for you. In this case, I think it makes sense, but yeah, it can get expensive. So make sure that you check this upfront to avoid any surprises. All right, so that's how I use Security Hub. I think that's all I have to say. So I like the service and I recommend that you enable it because I think it's one of the services where the price actually is kind of, or is stays in a good relationship between the value you get out of the service So it is actually actionable. So the findings are actionable. You get an understanding what you have to do. And most of them also make sense. So I recommend using it. If you haven't looked at Security Hub, I definitely recommend that you check it out. And as I mentioned, the first 30 days are free, so there's not much to lose. So that's a big advantage of Security Hub. All right, so that is how I use it. Let's talk about the pitfalls. The first is about the security score when you use Security Hub in this organizational mode. So the default calculation works like this. So we have all the enabled checks. We know how many of them failed. So this is the one where we have findings. Then we have unknowns. Okay, this is where we have errors. We have some of the checks that have no data. So for example, if you have no S3 bucket, then your S3 check will have no data because it cannot check any S3 bucket. We have the past checks, and we have the disabled ones. So the natural way to calculate the security score is easy. Number of passed divided by all the enabled checks. That's the percentage in your security score. So as I mentioned, the severity does have zero impact on that score. So you don't necessarily have to fix the high ones first. So if you are lazy, what you do is you fix the ones with each check has a number of findings. So for example, there could be a check that has 200 findings. And if you fix one of the findings, it has zero impact on your security score. There might be another check where there's only a single finding. If you fix that single finding, boom, your security score goes up. So for the lazy humans out there, including myself, you could start using on the high ones, but you could also just sort by findings and then start with the one with the lowest findings and work in that order. So you will have a very steep curve at the beginning and then it gets very slow at the end. So in terms of effort. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Okay, so now we understand how the security score is calculated. If we do that calculation for those numbers, so 57 divided by 71, we get 80%. As you can see, that number doesn't match with what you see on the screen. So something is wrong here. If you would do that calculation in Security Hub, if you are not using organizational mode, but if you run it just in a single account, this number would match with what you see on the screen. So if you are in security mode, if you are in organizational mode, we have to calculate a little bit different. So we take all the enabled checks, we look at the past ones, and we divide it by the enabled ones, but we also have to add the disabled ones if they have findings. So that is super confusing. Only if they have findings, they are taken into account in this calculation. If we do the math again, then we get exactly at 78%. So how can you fix that? So I was working with a customer and we closed findings, we made sure checks passed, and the security score was not really moving. We disabled lots of checks, security score was not moving. And you have to understand two things. First, it can take some time until the security score updates. So first, it takes some time until the check actually reruns and takes into account your changes. And then it can take, again, up to, I think in the documentation it's mentioned, it can take up to 24 hours until the aggregation in the org mode is current. So that's something to keep in mind. And then the other thing is that if you disable a check, it will still count into your security score and it will kind of lower it. So if you want to kind of make sure that the security score kind of reflects the reality, you have to suppress all the findings for the disabled security check. Only then your security score will be accurate. And so this is a little bit confusing. I was confused, at least when I first read about that behavior in the documentation. I think it's a bug. They made it a feature now, but I don't think that it makes a lot of sense. So I hope that will change in the future. But until now, we have to kind of manually suppress all the findings of a disabled check. All right, second pitfall. And this is actually also something I was running into when I looked at this in my own AWS account. We saw that earlier. Also, when I worked in customer accounts. And then I was kind of remembering, okay, I saw that error before in my own account. And then I compared a couple of AWS organization setups, and I saw that error in all of them. So I did some research. It turns out that in the AWS Security Foundation's best practice security standard, there are the IAM checks. And quite a few of them can error with the config rule evaluation error, internal error. So which is, as you might guess, not very helpful to understand what the root cause is. And they will show up in the overview as an unknown status. So unknown basically means, yeah, as I said, AWS is not able to kind of get to a decision if it's passed or failed. And then I looked for that error, and in the AWS forums, I see a post from December 2020 where AWS kind of says that, yeah, that's a problem. We know it. It is because of IAM rate limits. So we check too often, and that's why we run into rate limits. And when we run into rate limits, we don't retry. We just throw an internal error. And then the check is kind of in unknown state. And since December 2020, this hasn't changed. I mean, you saw it on my screen a couple of minutes before, and now it's April 2021. So yeah, in the blog post, in the forum post, they mentioned that they work on this with high priority. Not so sure about the priority here. But yeah, I think we can hope that this will be fixed, at least at some point in time, because we can't do anything about it. So it's an AWS rule, so we cannot change it. That's it. Those are the two pitfalls that I think you have to keep in mind when working with Security Hub. I hope you liked this kind of introduction into Security Hub. And as I promised, we will have probably more videos about security features on AWS. And you can reach out to us and the community about this topic and any other related AWS topic at community.cloudonaut.io. And this is also the perfect place to kind of give us feedback what security service you are interested in afterwards. So should we talk about GuardDuty first? Should we talk about Inspector first? Should we talk about IAM Access Analyzer first, or something completely different? Let us know. We take your feedback into account when kind of planning for the next videos. So that is much appreciated, and it really helps us to create good videos for you. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to rate this video if you learned something new today. Your feedback helps us to produce relevant videos. As I already mentioned, you can reach out to us via email, via Twitter, and the details are in the video description, or you can also find them in the community. So we are back in 1 week. Thanks for your support. Bye.